talk,
identity,
and access
management.
Welcome to the Identity at the Center podcast. This is Jeff, and that's Jim. Hey, Jim.
Hey, Jeff. How's it going?
Pretty good.
Good. You getting ready for vacation next week? Oh, wait. That's me going on vacation, not you.
Yeah, you're the madman going into a hotspot of COVID. So please do not contract anything because I'm going to be swamped if not. So.
You know what I find ironic, though, is that I'm going to Florida, for anybody who doesn't know, and I booked it like 3 months ago when it looked like Florida was a safe place compared to New York and New Jersey. Well, now New York and New Jersey are saying, hey, if you're coming from Florida, you're going to need to self-quarantine for 2 weeks. Wow, isn't that ironic?
Yep, that's the way it works. We're doing a great job of containing this, but I don't want to get political on it because like everything else, everything is political.
Everything's political, except the insider threat. That is still apolitical. I'm excited about having that as, our main topic today. And, I've always felt like, maybe it does get political, but I've always felt like it's an ignored area because I think the focus is so much on getting hacked from the outside. And, since I've been in IT, the standard approach has been a hard, crunchy shell and kind of soft on the inside. In other words, have a firewall, really guard the perimeter of your network, and then trust the people inside. Heck, Jeff, you and I work with clients all the time where we hear, we only have this number of people with administrative accounts. And what it boils down to is these are the people that we trust. But the insider threat is very real. And, we had one slide that we pulled from the Gartner IM Summit back in 19, feels like a century ago, but back in 19, and it talked about, the percentage of actors who make up each data breach. And what was it? Insiders are like over 30%. So it's a very real issue.
Yeah, I think that traditional thinking of the M&M, right, the crunchy shell and the soft GUI center is something that was, 20 years ago, maybe even up to 10 years ago. But, this whole zero trust framework has come about, which I think is good. And you do have to watch for the insider threat. A third of attacks, roughly come from the inside. And it's typically, you don't really care about your normal users other than as a means to an end, right? They want to get into the accounts that actually have access to things that are important from a data perspective or from a social engineering perspective, right? If you can breach the executive account, you can pretty much ask for whatever you want, people give it to you. So that's another way to do it. So it's a good thing that we're talking insider threat because we also have a guest today. We have from Preempt Security, Phil Meneses. Welcome, Phil.
Hey, thank you.
Thanks for joining us. Yeah. So, one of the things that we like to get into with all of our guests is before we get into kind of the topic here is kind of their background in IAM and, what they've been working on. And maybe we can start there. Phil, how did you get into IAM? Let's start there.
Sure. So I started my career in really software engineering and post-sales professional services. And then when I started in IAM was about 10 years ago. I joined a company called Imprivata, which focuses on strong authentication and single sign-on for hospitals and healthcare systems. I wanted to get into pre-sales engineering, so I started there as an inside SE, and then moved into selling in the field after a couple of years, then started to manage a team of about 8 to 10 SEs. From there, I had a year in a network security as a little bit of a gap, but then I missed it so much, I came back to IAM, focusing on security, where I am now at Preempt.
So you actually started with IAM, which is kind of interesting because most of the folks that we talk to, or at least in my experience, my theory is that most people who are in IAM didn't start there. They started somewhere else and then kind of fell into the IAM space. So thanks for blowing that up for me. Appreciate that.
Yeah. Well, I still share that theory with you, Jeff. I mean, I still think that's the majority of us and probably the listeners out there as well.
Yeah. And I started, but so before Imprivata, I was a software engineer. I was on the post sales side, and that was not IAM. That was complete. So your theory does still stand.
Okay, good save. Appreciate
Yep.
it. So now you're with Preempt Security. Can you tell us a little bit about what Preempt does and what you're doing for them?
Yeah, Preempt. So Preempt takes a look at your users' identities, users' behaviors, the different risks a user or an endpoint has, and combines those all together to understand where are the risks in your environment. How can we proactively address those risks, and then putting in place the ability to do things like trigger MFA or conditionally block access when rules are in place to decide that the user shouldn't be doing what they're supposed to be doing, or maybe they're doing something suspicious or malicious that should be contested.
So basically, the perfect person to have on to talk about insider threat, huh? So there's a report that you guys are working on, and you guys have been kind enough to, you know, share maybe some stats before that gets out there, and we'll have a link to it as part of our show notes for people who are listening out there. I know that you guys have been working on this for a while, and it's around the hidden risks of workforce identities. Maybe we can start with that. Are there, what are some of the key findings that you think you took away from what you might find in that report?
I think some of the biggest ones that I was surprised by were just taking a look at users and all users in general. We could found that 10% of all users were found to be high risk. So whether it's a privileged user, a regular user without privileges, a service account, 10% of those users had risks associated with them that considered that user to be high risk. So things that contribute to high risk, things like is the user using a compromised or weak password that's been part of a known breach? Mm-hmm. Are their password policies not strong enough? So do they have a password policy that doesn't require, let's say, over 10 characters, or the complexity is minimal? So those are just a couple of examples of factors contributing to high risk users. Mm-hmm. One other stat I thought that stood out: 15% of accounts are still authenticating with NTLM every week. That's a weak Microsoft Active Directory protocol that has been replaced by Kerberos, but there's still plenty of applications out there that require NTLM. So the fact that protocol is still out there and still is being used not just by regular users but by privileged users as well really exposes them to different types of attacks.
Yeah, and NTLM is really kind of designed for interoperability, right? So a lot of that's what happens when you try to do too much with one thing, right? You're trying to make things backward compatible. You have to inherit maybe some security weaknesses that come along with that. Jim, are you going to say something?
I was going to say, pretty much exactly what you said, but I was also going to say that NTLM, NT Landman, and I guess NT stands for new technology, right? Because that back in the NT 3.5 and NT 4.0 days, that was new technology. But NTLM has been around for a long time.
Right.
And one of the OGs, right, when it comes to Windows authentication.
Yeah, it's OG.
I think maybe they need to rebrand it. Maybe new technology isn't the right moniker for it, but I think it's too late now.
Yeah. AILM.
Yeah, it's definitely something
artificial intelligence landman. That would make it sound very new.
What were you gonna say, Phil?
Sorry, I was just gonna say we're definitely seeing customers trying to remove the amount of NTLM that's used in their environments, and it's a struggle. It's hard to fight that battle and understand who's using that protocol, where it's being used, where it's forced to being used. We see a lot of security tools using NTLM and requiring NTLM. So it's like the password. It's something that will be around for a while. We're trying to remove it from enterprises, but it's a tough thing to completely abolish.
Yeah, especially because a lot of these accounts maybe are service accounts, right? Or things along those lines, which
Right.
may not have multi-factor associated with it because of the nature of it. Right? You don't have a service account and you have some poor guy out there with authenticators going off every second, right? Trying to
Right.
approve everything. So,
Right.
well, I guess maybe we should kind of work its way backwards from. So if you've got an NTLM hash, right, where the Kerberos ticket might be going against, um, that's something that can be exported out of an organization and you can run brute force attacks on that. Is that right?
That's right. So one of the common attacks that we see is an attack called curb roasting, and what that is where typically service accounts have what's called an SPN associated with them, a service principal name that allows them to uniquely identify them and allows them to request an application to request that service authenticate. And what users can do, any user can do this, is request all of the accounts in an Active Directory that have an SPN associated with them. So it could be a service account, it could be a human account as well. So once that's done, requesting those Kerberos tickets for all of those users is where an attacker can take those tickets and attempt to crack those hashes offline via brute force. So if any of those users, whether human or service account, has a password that is weak because of having a bad password policy, or it's weak because it's been compromised or part of a known breach, that password or that hash can be easily cracked.
Yeah, I think I think that's really important for people to understand is that this is an offline attack, right? Once you've exfiltrated those password hashes, you can spend as much time as you want trying to crack it, those accounts or those hashes, I should say, without ever, coming up on anyone's radar, essentially. So really, the key is to kind of catch people who are requesting maybe the SPNs within an organization, right, or requesting an abnormal amount of Kerberos tickets, those sorts of things to try and identify a potential, compromise kind of incident. So I think that's really important to understand is that you said something key there is that, any Active Directory user can request it, right? And
Right.
Active Directory users are typically insiders, right? So, if you've got someone who is either assume the identity of one of your insiders or one of your insiders and is looking to do some damage, that's a great way to kind of work on it on your own time and come back. And, especially if you've got service accounts that are using, weak passwords or cracked passwords, this is why you want to have really strong passwords for those accounts that are randomized and never used anywhere else. You don't want to make it easy for people to kind of roast you from the inside.
Yeah, and it comes up all the time on when customers conduct pen tests. Curb roasting is one of the most common techniques used by pen testers, and usually is one of the findings that they have where they were able to successfully grab an account's credentials through that type of attack.
I wanted to interject here, Jeff, to just kind of talk a little bit about motives, because I think sometimes when it comes to this, it's maybe a little bit esoteric for a CISO of a company that hasn't traditionally thought of themselves as a target, right? I think the banking and financial services industry has long thought of themselves as a target because, hey, if I steal banking information from people, or potentially I can turn that into getting money. But it's really the information that leads to either the financial crimes. And heck, I mean, I think what we're seeing going on in the world, not just recent events, but just over the past couple decades, is really that there are other motives than just financial crimes. Financial crime still leads to is the majority, but just getting data about people, and stealing emails and things like that, you can either blackmail a company, which of course a financial crime, or you could just embarrass a company. And there are a lot of clients that we've worked with who are very afraid of kind of having a Sony type incident where their emails were dumped out on the dark web, and it just really hurt their company from a branding perspective. But I've talked to Caesars before who said, we're not a bank, we make food. That as long as you are the keeper of private information, as long as you have social security numbers, maybe you have even more sensitive PII data, you could be a target for these insider threats. So I guess the long and short of it is that I can't imagine any company that this isn't kind of a nascent issue to. And I think everybody who's listening should take this very seriously.
Absolutely.
And I guess what I'd like to do is even point this up, kick this back to Phil, because you're working a lot on inside threats. What are you seeing in terms of industries that seem to be more interested in this versus industries who are investing less on the insider threat, or are you seeing it pick up across the board?
I think I think across of all the industries, I think financial services is probably the highest, but really the interest is across the board. It's an issue in any vertical, and we're seeing that as we work with our customers. It's insider threats, it's external threats, it's really it's something that every customer, and you mentioned the food service industry, also the retail industry, healthcare. There's data to be taken and to be sold, and whether it's for a malicious intent or whether it's for just somebody snooping, it's users are trying to access things that they're most likely not supposed to be, and they'll find ways to do it. And that's, and getting back to service accounts, that's something that we often see. Service accounts have elevated privileges typically to do the tasks that they were made to do, but there's a human that has access to those service account credentials, and sometimes they'll leverage those credentials to perform their job quicker or easier because the credentials are available to them through that service account versus not having them through their own account. So it's definitely understanding what a service account is doing, where it's going, what it's accessing is very important, and especially how that service account is authenticating. Is it doing that scheduled task or what it was meant to do on a scheduled basis, or is it logging in interactively via RDP or an interactive logon where someone's actually using those credentials in a way they shouldn't be?
I think you hit one of the things that Jim and I see quite a bit when we're working with organizations around privileged accounts is, and service accounts specifically, is a lot of these have passwords that have been hard-coded or set and are not changed very often. So if you have a user who knows what that service account ID and password is, it can be difficult to change it, certainly in a timely manner, unless you've got tools in place that are helping you manage your privilege access. And people may walk out the door with that access and may keep it for a while until either they're discovered or someone decides to change the password. So I think it's important from a hygiene perspective to understand, as a privileged access management key holder, if you're responsible for those types of keys, is to make sure that those are being changed on a routine basis, and that when you have a termination event type thing, that anybody who could have had access to that you make sure that you definitely change those accounts.
Yeah, we see that every day where an application was brought in to an enterprise and back in 2005, and then a service account was created specifically for that application. It was set with high privileges, a password set to never expire, and then here comes 2020, and we see that same the password hasn't been changed in 15 years, It's still set to never expire, and now it's been part of a known breach, so it's considered a compromised password. So the combination of the high privileges not being changed in a long time, not needing to be changed, and the worry of an enterprise to change that password because they're nervous about what they're going to break if they do change that password, because they don't
Yeah,
know what that service account is doing.
it's a very real concern, but it's also like if you have a house and your electric bill is $200 a month, and you know that there's all these leaks, you've got to go around and start sealing them up. You can't just say there's so many leaks in this house that we'll never get to them all, so we're not going to do anything. Because I think if you go around and you close up, 50% of the leaks, you're going to drop that electric bill quite significantly. I think that's one way of looking at it. In other words, what I'm getting at is that, you don't have to be perfect to be better. And I think that's a big thing that holds people back, is that the enormity of the problem, the enormity of how do we get our arms around this situation. We have so many service accounts. You mentioned that service account after, and I know this area very well, where those service accounts, like, where are all the places it could be,
Mm-hmm.
it's being used and things like that. But if you have a service account sitting around for long enough, a lot of people who are no longer with the organization potentially know that password, right? Potentially that password's gotten out on the internet. Probably the password's very weak. Could be brute force potentially. If that comes back that was part of a breach, you can bet your bottom dollar they're going to change that password. So they're going to figure out a way to do it. So why
Yep.
wait until after the breach has occurred? I mean, that's unfortunately, that's what we see a lot in the industry, is that when do things get taken seriously? After they've gone too far, right? After a breach has occurred, now we're going to take it seriously. Well, too bad we didn't take it seriously before that.
Right. It's understanding where those risks are, as far as from a user perspective or from an endpoint perspective, and proactively cleaning them up. Just, again, like you said, you can't be perfect, but it helps a great deal if you can do it ahead of time before something bad happens.
One of the things that Jeff and I talk about a lot, because it comes back in various reports and surveys that are done, is how long it takes to realize that a breach has occurred. And I don't think that the numbers are consistent, because there's a report that came out recently that, shortened versus what I've seen in the past, which is, on the magnitude of 6 months plus to discover a breach. But I think, when I think about what has happened in IAM over the past 5 years, the definition of IAM is changing from who has access to what to who has access to what plus what's being done with that access. And that's, to me, really the next frontier, which is expanding our scope of IAM, not just to making sure that the right accounts have the right access and that we have strong controls over who can log in, but then monitoring the use of that access and being able to define patterns for normal behavior and identify when that normal behavior is not being followed. So, today, this account that only logged in as a service account once in a while, logged in through the VPN. It's never logged in through the VPN before. Whoa, well, maybe somebody better look into that, right? And I think that's the biggest change I've seen in IAM recently. I think there are a lot of things happening with AI and things like that, but to me, the understanding of what identities are doing on the network is really the big next frontier, and it helps with insider threats, and it helps with external outsider breaches as well.
Man,
Yeah,
if only there
totally.
was a podcast that, focused on identity and why it's important. Jeez. Where can I find something like that?
I don't know. There's one that's been around for about a year.
It's going up on that.
Yeah.
But you bring up a really interesting point, and that is that, identity really is at the center of a lot of these things, especially when it comes to threat detection. Phil, what kind of role do you see identity playing when it comes to identifying threats?
So, one interesting stat I saw recently was that 80% of attacks breach the identity store or credential compromise or an insider using credentials inappropriately. So, focusing on identity-based attacks just makes sense. It's if we're seeing the majority of attacks are on the identity side, it's obviously the best place to start to look at how are we going to detect these different types of attacks and also prevent them from continuing on, prevent them from moving across the network.
What are some of the things that organizations can look for when it comes to identity and trying to find, indicators of compromise?
So really things like, as Jim was just mentioning before, being able to identify a user or an endpoint, a user typically accessing servers A, B, and C. Now all of a sudden, for the first time ever, they're accessing server D. Is that something that should be allowed? Do you want to take an action on that? Do you want to alert somebody to the fact that happened? Trigger MFA, straight up block that access. Being able to see, again, starting with visibility, understanding where the risks are in your environment on a per user, per endpoint basis, being able to clean that up as much as possible. But where you can't, when you see indicators where somebody's doing something suspicious, being able to take an action on that.
Jim, what about you? What do you see as some other ways to look at identity and figure out if there's maybe a potential incident?
Well, I think, again, I think where identity comes into play is that in the past where we've had like a SOC or a NOC focus on where breaches may be taking place, it's been IP based. So it's been devoid of the context of identity. We've looked for, hey, here's some weird activity that's coming from this IP address across our network. But it's that identity context that tells you whether or not that fits in from a user behavior standpoint. And to me, that's really the key is layering in identity. Like I mentioned earlier with the, they're both important. IP is very important as well, because if you have a computer that all of a sudden is like scanning the network, it doesn't matter what identity they're using. That's a problem, right? That's a potential compromise that has happened within your network. But I mentioned that idea of, okay, we have a service account that logs in, I don't know, twice a year, because that's how often those servers get rebooted, for example. And all of a sudden it logs in from the VPN. That one-time event of logging into the VPN from an IP standpoint doesn't look like any kind of issue at all, especially if the login is happening from some, normal location, either, within the home country of that company, or if it's a global company, who knows? There's nothing about that login that looks suspicious until you take the identity context and wrap it around it. So to me, that's what's so important around, building a view from an identity standpoint of what is normal behavior, so that you can then identify what is abnormal behavior.
I think those building blocks are really important, right? You have to know who has access to what, and then what are they doing with it is really important. I think also too of like IAM hygiene when it comes to inactive accounts, dormant accounts, right? A lot of times you have accounts out there that haven't been used in a year, 2 years, 3 years, and people are afraid to remove them or, do whatever to clean them up because of the potential impact of what it might cause versus, the risk of what could happen if someone gets a hold of one of those accounts. So I think there's a lot of different ways that identity plays in that. Is there any difference between trying to figure it out at the identity layer versus maybe just taking a log-based approach, maybe something like through a SIM or a tool similar along those lines? I guess, Phil, maybe that's a question for you.
Sure. So when you're able to look at authentication as it happens at the protocol level, so looking at things like, and for a Active Directory as an example, NTLM, Kerberos, LDAP, LDAP-S, understanding and having the advantage to detect things that just aren't as easy to detect when looking at logs. Things like attacks like pass the hash, NTLM relay. We talked about Kerberosing. Log-based analysis is going to always be primarily detection. Trying to take an action and stop something suspicious and potentially malicious that happened minutes or hours ago, it's just way too late. You need to be able to really prevent something from happening, or prevent it from continuing to happen quickly. You really need to be able to look at the authentications as they're taking place.
Yeah, I think this is where artificial intelligence and machine learning has really kind of become a force multiplier for security operations and other folks who are looking at this, because I know that, in my past, one of the things that have been historically challenging is trying to find those needles in the haystack, right? And when you're looking at tons of logs all day long, right, you need help. And this is an area that, robots do really good at spotting patterns and helping kind of fluff things up to the top. Not perfect, but if they can reduce the chaff that's out there, it makes it easier to respond and approach to. And, in a fully mature and, cutting edge IAM system or IAM program where you've got a bunch of different technologies working together, you can even automate some of those things where, maybe you do see a service account logging in through VPN for the first time ever. And you've got that connected up with your IGA and your privileged access management systems, and you do something about it, right? Maybe you change the password on it, or you disable it, or you throw out an MFA or something along those lines to try and mitigate those attacks.
Yeah, it's something where if an analyst is receiving 10,000 alerts a day, it's going to be hard for them to decide which ones to react to and respond to and investigate. It's much easier to, after the fact, after the incidents occurred, to look back and say, oh, okay, we did detect this in our logs, but it was one of 10,000 which we didn't catch. So the fidelity of the different types of alerts that you're receiving has to be high.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's just, it's super important, right? If you can find it, you need to know what to do about it. And I think the if is a big part of the problem. So are there any specific types of threats that identity information can help stop, whether it's at the credential or at the identity store level?
Just looking at a deep look at the identity store on its own provides a ton of useful information. So just understanding the basic ability to understand who your privileged users are, not just the ones that are easy to find, in well-defined groups like domain admins, enterprise admins, account operators, but also the ones that are considered, what we call shadow admins or stealthy admins, ones that have been granted privileges, individual delegated privileges over time. Do they still need those privileges? They might have had a role in a company where they were part of the help desk team and they were resetting passwords. Now they've moved on to maybe a customer success or professional services role where they don't need that privilege anymore, but it was never taken away from them. So being able to identify the privileges of a user, of all your users, and being able to decide, does this user still need this privilege, is super important.
Absolutely. I know we're coming up on time here, and certainly appreciate helping us out with this topic. I think Kerber roasting is the word of the day, just because it's a great use of it. But before we wrap up here, Jim, do you have any thing that you want to add to what we've discussed so far today?
Yeah, I had a couple thoughts that I was holding on to here. So One of them is just, I think we have a lot of IAM practitioners out there. And I think about what your question there earlier of, logging. And to me, where you get your value from logging is what goes into the logs. Like, what are you collecting? Is it just basic information, or is there more to it? And I think as an IAM practitioner, it's our responsibility to establish a or a shared service that is clear and easy for application teams to use, and to make sure that they're logging the information that we need. Once we have the data, we can start to use the technology and the AI and the machine learning to give us value. But there's the whole thing, which is that as IM practitioners, we don't control the applications, and we are beholden to the applications at some level to provide us the data, the logs. And so I think it's our responsibility to make it available, which also leads me to think about another responsibility that we have, which is that, we have audit, I'm using the air quotes because there's a lot of different names for audit professionals, whether it's, security risk, whatever you want to call it, professionals within our organization who play an oversight role as a kind of checks and balances to what we do in IAM, or what applications are doing, and we're kind of the middleman making it available for audit. So I just want our listeners not to forget that we need to design systems so that it serves the purposes of those checks and balances, because ultimately at the end of the day, it's providing services to applications, but it's also making it so that it's secure, and the audit professionals play a key role in that, and kind of making sure that we understand their requirements. And usually they're pretty technical people, but not the most technical people. And so we need to kind of frame things in kind of their business language so that they can take this security information and make and be able to perform their activity, which is a checks and balance over what we're providing. The last thing I wanted to say was just, on the whole insider threat thing, I think what should be a very clear takeaway, if it wasn't already in your mind, is that, the trusting of people is honorable, right? But within our industry and within what we do for a living, trust but verify, I guess, is, that's the catchphrase that often goes with this. But trusting people is not the way to go. I always go back to a story of, I worked for a company, and there was the little old lady, the grandmother, who brought in chocolate chip cookies and worked for the company for 20 years, and everybody trusted her. And for 20 years, she was embezzling money from the company, a little bit at a time. And that just goes to show you, if you can't trust her, you can't trust anybody. And when people have super administrative rights, and they've been with the company for 10, 15 years, and they talk the talk, and you still need to have the checks and balances, and you still need to have the good governance processes over your identity and access management, and over information security as a whole. So that's what the insider threat thing is all about. Is just because somebody works for you, just because they've been a loyal employee, doesn't mean that they're not doing things in the background. Like Phil said, maybe it's for fun, maybe it's for gain. And, it really doesn't matter. People should be, following the rules, and not breaking into systems and things like that. So that's all I had to say about that, Jeff.
Okay. I want to make sure that we're very clear here too, is that chocolate chip cookies are totally fine to bring to the office. So don't take away that was negative. It was the embezzling part that was bad. The chocolate
Yeah,
chip
I'm
cookies were good.
glad you cleared that up. I'm sure people missed that point.
All right, Phil, anything you want to close up with?
Yeah, just to add to Jim's comment, a lot of times insiders might be doing something suspicious or malicious and intentional, but oftentimes it's completely unintentional. It's a mistake. They access something. They did something that they shouldn't have done, but it's not something that they were doing on purpose. So like you said, trust but verify. Make sure that the user is is what they're doing is, even though they might not be trying to do something harmful, if you can proactively stop that from happening, that's ideal.
Yeah, I think trust but verify is really important, and I like it you said that, because I first heard that phrase many years ago from former CISO that I worked with, Jim Camilli, and that was kind of the motto at the time, was trust but verify, and I think that's stuck with me through the years, is that trust is good, but you need to make sure that things are still being followed from a rule perspective. I'm glad you brought that up, so that's good.
But the hottest catchphrase right now, Jeff, is zero trust.
Zero trust but verify.
Right.
There you go.
That's the next extension.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I think that's a pretty good spot that we can leave it for this week. Phil, appreciate you taking the time to spend with us. I know that you're on LinkedIn, and I'll be sure to put that profile on our show notes, so that way if people out there have questions, for yourself or for Preempt, they can get a hold of you there. And looking forward to those findings getting published on the Preempt website at some point, and we'll provide a link to that as well in the show notes. And for folks who are following off the show, you can always visit us at identityatthecenter.com. And we'll go ahead and wrap it up for this week. And stay happy and healthy, everybody. Thanks for listening. You've been listening to the Identity at the Center podcast. For more episodes, visit identityatthecenter.com.